Sunday, April 17th, 2016, and this is the Product Mentor Talk. Today, we're joined by one of our mentors, James Alexander, Associate Partner, IBM Interactive Experience, to lead a talk on Google's 70-20-10 rule for driving product innovation. So let me just briefly explain the format for you. People you see kind of that join us, that are in the room or might join us a little bit later, are mentors and mentees from the Product Mentor Program. And the Product Mentor Program is a program where we pair up mentors and mentees in the field of product management to make better product managers and, in turn, better products. So I'm going to just quickly introduce myself. I am Jeremy Horn, aka The Product, and I'll be moderating here today. And throughout the talk, this is a live talk, so you can always submit your questions. You can submit your questions to theproductmentor.com/live, where you can watch the video and ask questions there. As the questions come in, I'll feed them right on to James. If you ask the off-topic questions or more generic product management questions, it's not that I didn't see the question. I'm just going to save the more generic stuff for the end. I'll keep the topical stuff flowing as real time as possible. But with all that said, without more ado, let me hand it over to James to kick off his talk.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. So I'm just going to go and bring up my presentation and tell you a little bit about my background. As Jeremy said, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about Google's 70-20-10 rule of innovation. And I don't know that this actually belongs to Google, but they surfaced it back around 2005 or so, so we'll give them credit for it. So just in terms of who I am, just to give you some context for what I'm going to be talking about and where I come from. So I recently joined IBM and specifically their Interactive Experience group at IBM. And I joined about 7 months ago, and let me see here if I'm sharing. There we are. Much better. All right, fantastic. So, so I joined IBM about 7 months ago, and specifically a group within IBM that is focused on customer experience, end-to-end customer experience. And this is something that is been going on at IBM for actually a very long time. I think when we think about IBM, we think about big iron and big systems. But the reality is that it's not just the back end that IBM and IBM clients care about, it's the front end as well. And customer experience has become more and more important over the years, especially as companies like Apple have shown how important and how much of a differentiator customer experience can be. And so they've been recruiting folks like myself with entrepreneurial backgrounds to come in to this one specific group, Interactive Experience. And so I bit the bullet, and I've been having a great time over the last 7, 8, 9 months or so. I also spent 7 years, a little over 7 years as a product management executive at Adobe Systems, and specifically running a portfolio of early stage and later stage businesses at Adobe, and specifically doing 2 early stage opportunities, which I'll talk about here as well, because from an innovation perspective, Adobe trying to innovate along with many more mature technology companies in Silicon Valley can be challenging, and we'll take away a number of lessons from that experience. But in addition to the corporate life, I've also done 3 startups. I've had 2 successful exits over the years. Probably the most fun startup I had, I started in 1995, and it was really the first internet monitoring service. We were monitoring public discussion on the internet for Fortune 1000 companies, telling them what was being said about their brands online. And this predates Twitter and Facebook and all the big social networks. There were different social networks at the time. But even back then, at the beginning of the internet, companies were keenly aware of the fact that their brands, their stock prices, other parts of their business could be affected positively and negatively by public discussion on the internet. And anyway, I sold that company to PR Newswire in around 1999. And over the course of my career, I've also earned 12 patents. And so from an innovation perspective, if you want to quantify innovation to some extent, patents are one way that companies and people do that. And so so I've got a few under my belt as well that are now owned by about half a dozen companies or so. So that's a little bit about me and my background, and it's always important to kind of know who's talking, and so that's my experience that'll influence the talk today. This is a fun talk, and it's good to have it at the sort of the end of a process like this, and it's really sort of the culmination of you get to sit down in a room and you've got a roadmap, you've got folks coming at you with all kinds of ideas. Maybe your boss sits down and says to you, hey, we need to be more innovative. And so a model like this is one potential tool. There are probably a few tools out there to use as a way to help yourself and your teams in managing up to think about where innovations and where ideas fall on the spectrum. So it's a good talk, and it's a good tool for us to have. So basically, in the early 2000s, Google had a couple of rules, golden rules. One was don't be evil, and the other was this rule for managing innovation. And it was introduced by Eric Schmidt into the company, and he talked about it in a 2005 Business 2.0 magazine article. That's kind of where it first surfaced. But basically, the idea, as you can see here, he just said we live by these rules. We spend 70% of our time on core product features and enhancements. We spend about 20% on adjacent features and product ideas, and 10% on stuff that is just way out there. And we all do it, and it all works really well. So what does he mean by that? What is this? You have to break this down sort of a visual. So here's it, not necessarily to proportion, of course. The core there on the lower left would be about 70% of the overall square. But the idea here with core is that you're really targeting existing customers and serving existing markets, and you're really doing innovation around your existing products. So I give you an example of that from my Adobe days. So with Adobe Photoshop back in the mid 2000s, we introduced a new tool in Photoshop called the healing brush, and it was a really revolutionary tool at the time. You basically, if you haven't used it, you actually use variations of it now because it's been replicated. But you basically just you touch a spot on a photo that you want to make look better, and it magically looks better. It's an incredible technology and a really great idea, and it was very innovative at the time. But that was an example of a core innovation. It enhanced an existing product or service. And so that's what we mean by core. So you're still innovating, but you're really doing it around your existing business. And in fact, when Eric Schmidt talked about core at the time of this interview, he was talking about how he's focusing 70% of his time, or the team was, around optimizing search and ways to make the search algorithms better. So again, very core, but doing very innovative things around the core. So then we move out, and this is where the 20% comes in. And in fact, Google's known for having sort of this 20% rule. I spend 20% of your time on stuff that's not your own. That's a little different here, but the adjacent concept is it touches your core business, but it's maybe reaching out to an adjacent market or a new set of customers, and it may be extending the product as necessary to go into those markets. So I'll give you an example again from the Adobe days. So here we had Illustrator, for instance, Adobe Illustrator, and that was rolled out in the mid-1980s, and it was, I think, in large part a business development activity to help sell more PostScript on printers, which is how Adobe got its start. But with that core group of illustrators designing really rich, visually rich digital files on the computer, Adobe then went out and in the early 90s bought Photoshop. And so there's an example of really more of an adjacent type play where you have a core set of customers, in this case illustrators, but they're still creative professionals. and then you're going and you're saying, okay, we're gonna add a new set of tools and a new customer base. In this case, photographers who are also very much creative professionals. But that's an example of doing something that is doing something that's adjacent. And then the transformational piece. So the point here is to spend about 10%. If you follow the rule, about 10% of your time, give or take, on really thinking about new products, new markets, different kinds of customer needs. And at the time when Eric Schmidt was talking about this rule that they were using in Google in 2005, he identified one of their transformational efforts as being their public Wi-Fi project. So if you've ever been in New York and you've gone to Bryant Park, for many years, Google was the supplier of Wi-Fi in the park, and at the time that was viewed as a very transformational type activity. So just walking through this, I'm going to have a couple more examples, but that's the idea behind core, adjacent, and transformational. Core is about 70% of your time, give or take, for the business, about 20% on adjacent, and about 10% or so on the transformational pieces. And just to give some more examples to help you kind of think through this, I love this example. So Nabisco with Oreos. I look at this package every night, and basically, the cookie hasn't really been improved here. But what they did was they looked and they said, how can we make the experience with our product better? And so this definitely falls into a core type of innovation. What they do is they made the package easier to get into. So you didn't rip the package at the end and the cookies get all stale, or the crumbs leak all over the place. They basically just came up with a better way to get into the product. So the product remained the same, but the experience was vastly improved. And then not only that, of course, there was a whole safety piece around the opening of this package, so you knew if when it had been opened. Not a safety issue at the house here, but of course it's good to know when my kids have gotten into the Oreos. You can't kind of hide from this when this thing opens up. So in any event, great example of, again, a core innovation. Definitely innovative, definitely different, but it's not opening up Oreos to a new market. Another example of a adjacent innovation. I'll fall back on my Adobe days. So I launched a new service in the product called Adobe Stock Photography, Adobe Stock Photos, back in 2004, and we rolled that out into Adobe Creative Suite 2, which launched in 2005, and we put it in Adobe Creative Suite 3 as well, which rolled out in late 06, early 07, and so the idea here and why this is adjacent is that we basically had our core group of customers, but there was a business that we weren't in, but we knew that we owned the Creative Pro desktop, and by 2004, 2005, we had the entire suite of products with Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator, and then InDesign, of course, which was competing with Quark, After Effects, all the video tools, and so. But they were shrink wrap tools. You basically bought the discs and they downloaded, or you downloaded it, but you installed it, and but that was it. Basically, all the content was up to you. So we knew that our customers were going from Photoshop or Illustrator, InDesign, going out to stock photo agencies like Getty Images, iStock Photo, Corbis, Jupiter Images at the time, and licensing stock photography. First doing searches, finding images, doing mock-ups in brochures and on websites, and then once a client approved that, they'd go back to Getty or Corbis or Jupiter, and they would license the high-res image and bring that back into the application, and they'd have to make all the changes that they'd made, to the comp, so that they could preserve, what all the work that they had done. And so it was extra work and extra steps, and it was hard. And sometimes, back around that time, printing was still very much being done, and so you'd hear, if you go out and talk to your customers and actually watch how they're doing it. I know that Jen had talked about going out and watching your customers in the last session. If you actually go watch the workflow of customers, what we found was that sometimes they would actually send a brochure to press with a low-res image in it, a comp image, and that's expensive. You print 10,000 brochures and you got to throw them away and reprint them. So it seemed like there was an opportunity for Adobe to start to offer services that lived inside these shrink wrap products. And so, I and a small team initially, and we grew the team to about 50 people by the time we got up and running at steady state. But we created a new service called Adobe Stock Photos that was basically integrated into the creative applications and enabled the creative professionals to stay within our apps but go out to the stock photo agencies. And we're basically a distributor of content from Getty and Corpus and Jupiter. But that's an example of an adjacent innovation, something we'd never done before. We're definitely opening up to new potential markets, although we were serving the core, but it was an adjacent type of service offering that added additional value to significant additional value, and was very innovative because it wasn't shrink wrap software, it was actually a service. And at the time, Adobe really was trying to figure out how to do services. So that's an example of an adjacent, another example. And then, of course, back to the core, just to hammer home, the example of what a transformational type innovation might be. And Apple is such a great use case for these things. You think about the iPod. That was at the time incredibly transformational. Opened up, a whole new set of customers. Before they had 1% to 2%, maybe 3% max on penetration of Macintosh computers, and predominantly it was in the home market or the Creative Pro market. So to go into the music business was, just completely out of left field, and completely opened up a whole new set of customers to Apple. And then they followed that up with the iPhone. Again, completely transformational. You wouldn't think about the company going into the phone business, although the better and the smaller the iPods got, it got to be clear that they were thinking about that. But still, there's one thing to think about it and another to actually go and execute on that. And then with the Apple Watch, released last year, again, something that is new, that's different, can open up a completely new market for Apple. And so, just an example, another great example of a transformational type innovation. So we have this sort of rule of thumb that Google's talking about, 70%, 20%, 10%. So where's the meat? Is there anything really to it? And interestingly, a Harvard Business Review published an article called "Managing Your Innovation Portfolio" a couple years ago, and basically the authors went through and actually tried to test and look and see if there's anything to this golden ratio, if you will, for innovation. And it was really interesting. They had two findings. One of the findings was that companies that did allocate, give or take 70% of the innovation activity to core and 20% to adjacent and 10% to these transformational type innovations, actually did outperform their peers. And for those that were publicly traded, had a price earnings premium of about 10 to 20%. So from a data perspective, this rule of thumb seems to have some basis in reality and is substantiated in the market. But they've had another finding, which was also very interesting, but makes sense when you think about it. What they found was that the return on investment was roughly the inverse. So the core innovation efforts were really only contributing about 10% of the long-term return on innovation investment, whereas at the other end of the spectrum, the transformational efforts were contributing 70% of the cumulative return on innovation investment. And I think we want to unpack that and understand what's going on there. But so if you kind of put the two side by side, if you're doing the 70-20 10, then there's a body of data that supports that your company will be doing, your organization or your team will be doing better by 10 to 20%, and that will be valued in the market more than not having some kind of organization around this. So in other words, if you're only spending 10% on core, and you're spending 70% on transformational, that's out of whack. That's way too much. You're not focused on the core business, and you're missing opportunities, and you're ignoring your customers while you're out chasing the dream. So that's an example of what not to do. But if you're in the 70-20-10, it appears that there's a payoff. And then on the right side, it kind of seems like, well, what's going on here? So I've got 70%. I'm investing 70% of my time, but long term, I'm only getting 10% of my return on innovation from these activities, and it makes sense. I'm going to talk about it in a second. But if you've got your core business and you're cranking away, then you really shouldn't expect to have a huge return on your investment here, because you're really just moving the needle incrementally. And the 10%, if you're spending 10% of your time on these transformational opportunities, and it requires a different approach, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But if you hit one out of the park, if you nail it, then you are going to enjoy a much larger return, because your business will fundamentally change. And I'll fall back on iPhone, and just as a way to kind of put the period on an explanation point. It doesn't look like if you look at Apple, Apple's not the same company that they were when they released the iPhone. The predominant bulk of their revenue was coming from computer sales. But if you look at the revenue mix today, the predominant bulk of their revenue is coming from phone sales. So there's sort of the best way to illustrate that when you go out and you are doing these transformational innovation investments, that your company will be moving, or your efforts, your organization will be moving with market demand and in new market demand areas that you aren't currently in today, and your business will grow. And so your own revenue mix may wind up changing and inverting, and that's the example, and that's in essence what these two findings that were in the Harvard article talk about. So really interesting. So why do the investments in these transformational innovation have higher returns long term? So just to kind of put the bullets behind the story. So on the left, with the core market reality, we have what's going on. So we're competing in an existing market space. So even though we're innovating, and innovating in terms of whether we make the package better, or the experience better, or we add a new feature to a product, to continue to make that product relevant to the market, the reality is we're still in an existing market. So the next cookie guy could rip off the package design or come up with a slightly different way to do it once you've shown them how. The concept of the healing brush is in every single photo editing package today. So there really isn't necessarily a lot of differentiation there. So you're competing. You've got to beat the competition. You have to exploit existing demand. I mean, this is a slog, So you're spending 70% of your time dealing with this stuff on the left side of the screen. you got crowded space, so you in essence are your product will eventually become commodity like. So so just sucks up a lot of time and effort, and so you're just not going to get the return out of that. And if we look over on the right side, so here's the kind of exciting. I mean, if you're able to identify a new market opportunity, and a product or service or something that you can create value for that new market opportunity, you're effectively creating a new market. It's uncontested market space. There's nobody else there because there is nothing there. There's no business there, or you're getting in it so early. Like think about iPod. There were digital players in the market for years before Apple got in with iPod, but the market really hadn't taken off. And so in some respects, that's almost the best of both worlds, because you have a very small competitive situation that you have to deal with. But if you have confidence of knowing that you can make it better, and you have the distribution network and the brand cachet to blow a market like that open, then you're benefiting on the backs of some early pioneers, but you're gonna seal the deal. So uncontested market space, that means it's all greenfield. So you get in and you basically have the entire market to yourself. You're making the competition irrelevant, but you also are creating and capturing new demand. So that's not inexpensive, but if you do that successfully, then you're going to have that payoff much sooner. You're going to have it to yourself. This is why you're seeing, why the numbers show that 70% of your return on innovation is going to come from that 10% of effort. And ultimately, if it is a new business, then like all new businesses, your growth is is going to be fast, because numbers are small. So the initial early numbers, you're going to be growing very, very quickly, and so that just becomes more momentum in the business to sustain it and keep the level of investment going. So we basically have talked about the 70-20-10 rule. We've talked about that examples of what that is, what each of those three areas are. We've looked at some data that supports it in the market as a rule that does produce returns. And if you're wondering who's actually out there spending, interestingly enough, that's public data as well. PricewaterhouseCoopers does a study every year looking at what the R&D spend is of publicly traded companies, and rates them out. And it is literally staggering. These companies spend about $1 trillion a year. The top 20 R&D spenders are investing about $165 billion a year across those three areas of core, adjacent, and transformational. But I think a lot of these dollars are going towards the transformational. And if you break out the top 20 spenders spending about 9%, 165 billion, the next 21 to 1,000 are only spending about 481 billion. So the companies that are really investing in the future, it's worth noting who those are, because they have a culture internally, and they're hungry to be innovating and investing. The next 1,000 to 2,000 spenders drops to 48.5 billion, and then the rest kind of bring it the rest of the way home. So so it's just interesting to go and look at who is actually spending money on these core, adjacent, and transformational innovations. But interestingly enough, it doesn't matter what you spend. Only the top 5 spenders were ranked most innovative, and you can see here from Apple, Google, Amazon, Samsung, Tesla, 3M. This was a survey of people who are in senior executive innovation positions at large companies. And this is the perception of who's actually the most innovative. But if you look at these 10 spent 43% less than the real top 10 in terms of spending. So you've got a situation here where these companies are getting an even higher return on, potentially higher return on innovation than their peers are. So when we start to digest these concepts and need to start to communicate these out to our teams or to management, one of the things to think through is how to have a balanced portfolio. You sort of think about 3 tiers, pioneers, migrators, settlers, and as you look at your own product portfolio, to be thinking about where your products fall, and to some extent, pioneers are your transformational innovations, migrators are your adjacent, and settlers are your core, and you want to have a mix in a portfolio that is skewing. You don't want to be completely out of settlers. You don't want to all have your chips and migrators or pioneers, and that's where the 70-20-10 concept comes into play. And if we kind of map this against, just to kind of help you bring home the concept, again, we'll pick on Apple. So in starting in 1997 with the Mac, and as time progressed, in 2003 they introduced the iPod. That was one of their transformational innovations. So that's up in pioneers. And then as you look out a few years later, they've got iPhone and the App Store. Again, these are pioneers. Macintosh is business is growing, but it really just kind of stays where it is. It's not moving up into core because it wouldn't. Why would it? But interestingly enough, if we look at the trajectory of the iPod, iPod really drops out of pioneer because by 2008, digital music players, there's really nothing new about them. Every phone can play music, so it's an important business. It's a big business for Apple, but it's not. It's no longer that transformational innovation that it was. And eventually, down here, just a couple of years ago, it drops down and starting to move into the settler category. And then, of course, we have iPad, and if we'd gone out one more year, we'd have iWatch or Apple Watch up here in Pioneer. So you have this sort of this trajectory up into the right with your transformational innovations. And the point here is, and this is from another thought process called Red Oceans and Blue Oceans, Blue Ocean strategy. But the concept here is we have these waves of innovation, and we need to keep building the transformational innovation into our portfolio, because eventually those transformational will really drop down to getting to being adjacent and eventually core. And so we need to keep this process moving throughout, and that's what's exciting about being a product person, is that it's our job to wherever we are to be driving these innovations throughout the organization, and they require different skill sets as well, whether you're whether you're up in core, or whether or you're down in core, or whether you're doing the transformational type. There really are sort of different skill sets, and so just want to touch on how you get organized really to manage around this innovation system, to help facilitate the 70-20-10. So we'll just look at five buckets. So we've got talent, integration, funding, pipeline management, and metrics. So on the talent side, core, adjacent, and transformational innovation really require different skill sets. And to some extent, for example, I represent a skill set that's more closer to transformational, with my background in startups and doing early stage product development inside large organizations. And that's one of the reasons IBM wanted someone like me in. We've got thousands, tens of thousands of people that are working on our core products and extending them into adjacencies, but we don't have a lot of folks running around with sort of an entrepreneurial point of view, and so there's just a different way that I will approach a problem than a core product management person whose job is to make sure that the next iteration of a product, the next version, doesn't break anything from the previous version, and captures whatever they think the next set of challenges and problems are that the customers of that particular product have to solve over the next 12 to 24 months. Whereas folks like myself and like many folks who are listening to this, if you're thinking transformational, then we're thinking longer term out. We're thinking we're thinking about how customers may not even be thinking about using a product, and so you really need to think as you build a team, where people are most comfortable. A lot of people are not comfortable living and thinking out really far into the future. A lot of folks are comfortable, and really just focused on the ethnography of going and seeing, hey, what's going on with my product today, and so we want to set everyone up for success with respect to that. I will tell you, though, it's interesting that IBM is pushing everyone very hard to begin to be thinking about a new transformational concept called cognitive computing. I'm going to touch on that in a minute. So the next piece to think about with your innovation system is around integration. So how are these teams?
Actually, I'm gonna jump in there. We've got a question from Ariba, so I'm going to hand it over to her to ask her question.
Hey, Reba.
And it looks like we can't hear her. So the question Ariba had was, what are they doing differently that they're getting a higher return than the other companies who are investing more in R&D? And are they doing more transformational work?
So I think the concept on the return piece is not about any specific company specifically, but really over the course of the all of the companies that they looked at, that they are getting, they're seeing that they're getting this return. I think it's I think the point here is, if you are not investing in your next iPod, then you will not be able to, you will not benefit from that new business opportunity, that extension financially, when the rest of the market has moved into that space, and you'll be stuck selling Macintosh computers to that small subset of the business that you've carved out for yourself. And so the point here is that you need to be investing some amount of your time to be looking for these new areas, so that and a lot of this is going to fail. There are I mean, I'm at Adobe and at IBM, it's littered with business ideas that just didn't end up going anywhere. But you only need one or two to begin to pull the company into a new market, or open up a new market for you to benefit.
Great. So yeah, we don't have any other questions right now, but we are nearing the end of the talk, so it's the last chance for everyone to get their questions in before we all disappear. So submit your questions to theproductmentor.com/live, and with that said, back to you, James.
So thanks, Jeremy. So we'll wrap up here on these last other points. So integration is a really important thing to think through with respect to where where the organization will sit. So core innovation and adjacent innovation, it makes sense for the people who are going to be thinking about those things to be close to the teams that or sitting with the teams that are managing those products. But there are a lot of examples on the transformational side where those teams actually sit away from the core business, and it makes sense to do that. You don't want to be distracted. You don't want to be bogged down. You don't necessarily want to influence the existing team. So you think about like Xerox PARC, where back in pre Macintosh days, where Xerox had literally located an entire research facility, or Bell Labs. And there are plenty of modern examples where entire teams that are focused on transformational initiatives are actually sitting separate from the business. Funding is obviously important. Core and adjacent type innovations are, the funding for those will likely come out of the existing product P&Ls, because that's where those teams are, and part of what they're paying for are sort of the next iterations of innovation. But the transformational innovations are really important to understand from a cost perspective, because first of all, many of these are going to fail out of the gate, and so you can't necessarily tag those with the same set of criteria that you would a more parochial or core type of innovation. Likewise, you have to understand that if you're going to commit to an investment in a transformational area, that it can take a while for an idea to take root. I mean, you're really talking about creating new products that the market doesn't even know why they need them yet, and so to build a market from scratch is expensive, and so it's very important that that management understand that that's what they're signing up for from a funding perspective. On the pipeline, pipeline might be backlog for a core product, maybe an adjacent as well, but transformational innovation is really much harder to manage in the sort of linear stage gate process that can be used, or that you might see in these innovation models. So, and I guess to give you an example, so at IBM we're actually in the middle of something called the cognitive build. And so all 400,000 IBM employees have been invited to develop and submit an idea for something that would leverage cognitive computing. So this is where sort of cognitive computing is sort of a place, bet the company strategy at IBM, and cognitive is basically computers that can understand information, both structured and unstructured. They can learn. They can learn from that, and then they can reason. They can come up with decisions on their own. And so we're going through this sort of classic this classic stage gate process for what I think the company views as what will be sort of adjacent type innovations to our core business, and it's going to work really well. But the challenge with transformational innovation is that you really don't know what the right approach is for a market that doesn't exist yet, and so that requires a different overall approach that isn't necessarily going to yield this idea through this step, through this step, through this step. It's going to be more scattershot and require an organization to have a little more faith and a little more patience around an idea. And I'll just give you one example as well around transformational ideas. So PDF, we couldn't live without it. You'll probably get copies of this deck in PDF. Well, back in the early 1990s, the only person who really supported and loved the idea of PDF was a guy named John Warnock at Adobe. Everybody else on the executive team wanted to kill PDF, but he just thought that there was a market here. There was some need to have a container, a data container that would, in essence, render perfectly some design and some layout, whether it's a book or whether it's a brochure, or whether it's a PowerPoint presentation, and he kept it alive, and he hung in there, and he kept looking for other markets, and then in 1993, 1994, the internet came along, and boom, there was the perfect reason for why PDF was going to be needed. And so that's an example of what I mean by transformational information. Transformational innovations are much harder to manage, and they require a different approach. And then lastly, metrics. We have to measure. For core and adjacent innovations, it's much easier to set metrics for for usage. Well, whatever the metrics happen to be, but ultimately we want to see those things being used, however we choose to measure that. But more transformational type innovations may need a different kind of measurement approach. For instance, I'll give you an example of something that's recent. So Slack, maybe some of you use Slack. It's interesting if you look at. They may actually not be measuring their business right. There's an interesting article recently talking about how if Slack's mission is to basically do away with email and help people become more efficient, then Slack really shouldn't be looking at increasing daily active use, monthly active use. They should really be looking at decreasing it. And I think that's a sort of an interesting way to think about a transformational product like Slack. And the metrics that don't necessarily jive for what the stated goal of that particular product happens to be. So thinking about how we measure these across core, adjacent, transformational will ultimately, we need to not assume that we'll be using the same kinds of metrics, but be open to the fact that we may be measuring things at each end of the spectrum a little differently.
So we've got a couple questions that have come in. The first one comes from Ariba, and she's asking, how do you pick metrics for transformational innovation, especially if the market doesn't exist yet?
So I think that largely depends on what your innovation happens to be. So I think you're going to have to look at what it is in the context of what the job is to be done that you think your innovation will do, and then back into your metrics from there.
And the next question comes from an anonymous individual, and so they're asking, what is the best way to keep yourself up to date about competitors' innovations?
Competitors are a lot of fun. So I mean, the first thing to do is you can do a bunch of things. So one is set up your Google alerts, looking at putting what the competitor's name, the competitor's products in. That will give you real-time telemetry on what the competitors are doing and what they're up to in the market. That's number one. Number two, if you're customers, if you share customers with competitors, then you should continue to talk to your customers. But as part of talking to your customers, maybe open up a new line of questioning about the competitive landscape. You're using our product. This is great. Thank you very much. By the way, are you seeing other solutions coming to market that may interest you? If they interest you, why? Have you ever talked to fill in the blank XYZ company? You have to assume that if you're out talking to your customer and they're big enough for you to go and talk to them, that your competitor is also probably talking to them. It may be that your competitor is previewing some new technology. Certainly at Adobe, when we were building Adobe stock photos, we went out and spent months in the field with creative pros. We were showing them prototypes of Adobe stock photos. We were talking to them. If anybody had gone and talked to the creative pros we were talking to, I'm sure they would have found out that Adobe was working on something in the space. So I would add that as a second line when you're talking to your customers, and just ask them what they're seeing in the market from a competitive standpoint.
Excellent, excellent. Don't have any other questions, so I'll let you kind of do your wrap up. So just kind of bringing it all together. So companies that invest 70% of resources on core innovations and 20% on adjacent and 10% on transformational are typically outperforming their peers and enjoy a higher price to earnings ratio.
companies, and this is an amazing stat, companies are, spend $1 trillion annually on innovation. If your company isn't doing it and you want to innovate, it's pretty easy to go find the ones that are. Go dig out the current PricewaterhouseCoopers study, and that'll be a who's who of companies that are spending on innovation. We need to be innovating thoughtfully, and if we do, we'll actually save money and amplify impact, and that gets to the point of that 10% effort on transformational transformational innovations will ultimately result in as much as 70% of your return on investment down the road. And think about the iPod as an example of that, and how that transformed an iPhone, and how those products transformed Apple's business, and in essence dwarfed the computer sales. By the way, computer sales for Apple are still going up as well during the same period. So just all the more to the point about how those innovations really helped that Apple move into the next phase of its life. Of course, many existing industries are crowded and commoditized, and so the core and the adjacent innovations are very important to continue to make a product relevant. But it's because of this crowded marketplace that many of us are in, and the ultimate commoditization of the products that we sell, that we need to be thinking about those pioneers, those transformational innovations. One of the key points that I keep coming back to personally, and it's just a reminder of part of the reason for thinking about transformational innovation and being a pioneer, is that what you're really doing is you're creating entirely new markets where no customers exist and no competitors exist, and that's scary. It's expensive. In time, it's expensive. You need to find ways to get into those things in a low-cost, fail-fast way. But ultimately, once the company chooses or the organization chooses to move down that path, it can be very expensive, and so it's scary. But the reality is that that's fun and that's exciting. And finally, successful product managers, it's incumbent upon us to build a balanced portfolio. So we don't just want to be focused on these transformational innovations. We have to have this balanced portfolio. Focus on the core business, do our jobs, deliver a product that meets customer needs, tomorrow, and extend through adjacency and transformational opportunities. But we have to constantly be just making sure that our portfolio and our backlog and the things that we're spending our time on are in fact balanced. Back over to you.
All right. So again, I just wanted to thank our speaker, James Alexander, Associate Partner at IBM Interactive Experience, for today's discussion of Google's 70-20-10 rule for driving product innovation. And as always, the presentation will be posted to our SlideShare channel. And a big thank you from me, Jeremy Horn, the product guy, and everyone else who joined us today on the Product Mentor. And also, don't forget, if you're interested in being a product mentor like today's speaker, James, to product people of all sorts all around the world, visit theproductmentor.com and sign up today to be a product mentor. And also, Session 6 starts January 8th, so definitely sign up today so we can be in touch with you soon. And also, if you're looking to fill a new product job with a great product person, visit our very own free-for-all job board at theproductjobs.com. And with all that said, thanks everyone, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.